All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're talking about a really fascinating class of drugs, the ones that are true masters of controlling our muscles. I mean, on one hand, they can make a person perfectly still for life-saving surgery, and on the other, they can soothe a painful spasming back. We're talking about skeletal muscle relaxants, and we're going to get into how they work, from ancient poisons all the way to modern medicine. So our story doesn't start in some sterile lab. Nope. It starts deep in the Amazon rainforest. South American tribes there figured out how to make this incredibly potent arrow poison called curare. And when they used it for hunting, it didn't always kill the animal right away. Instead, it did something pretty amazing. It paralyzed them, just stopped them in their tracks. And this powerful stuff from a plant was really our first ever glimpse into how you could block the body's own muscular system. And from that pretty dramatic start as a hunting tool, scientists got their hands on it and started to figure out its secrets. They wanted to know how it worked. And in doing that, they turned this arrow poison into a cornerstone of modern anesthesia. It's pretty incredible to think about. A hunting tool that's now used to save lives on the operating table every single day. Okay, so what are we really talking about when we say muscle relaxants? Well, they basically fall into two big groups. The first group is the heavy hitters. We're talking neuromuscular blockers. These are the drugs that cause total paralysis, and you really only see them used during surgery. Then there's the second group, the centrally acting relaxants. These have a much gentler effect. They're the kind of thing you might be prescribed to ease those painful spasms, from a back injury or something like that. Now, to really get how these drugs can do what they do, we've got to zoom in, like way in, all the way down to the microscopic level, to the exact spot where our nerves talk to our muscles. Because that's the control panel. That's where all the magic happens. And this little command center has a name, the neuromuscular junction, or just NMJ. It's this tiny gap between the end of a nerve and a muscle fiber. And every single voluntary move you make, blinking, walking, anything, it all depends on a signal making its way successfully across this little space. The easiest way to think about it is with a lock and a key. Your nerve ending releases a chemical messenger. That's the key. It's called acetylcholine. This key floats across that gap and fits into a very specific lock, a receptor that's sitting on the muscle cell. And when that key turns the lock, bam, the muscle contracts. It's that simple. And as you've probably guessed, muscle relaxants work by very cleverly hacking this exact system. So let's go back to those really powerful drugs, the ones used for surgery. Anesthesiologists basically have two totally different tricks up their sleeve to block that signal and make a muscle go limp. And these two tricks are called competitive blockade and depolarizing blockade. Now, they both end with the same result, paralysis, but they get there using completely opposite strategies. It's actually a pretty cool example of how you can get the same outcome by either blocking a signal completely or by totally overwhelming it. And this table just lays out how different they really are. With a competitive block, like the original curare poison, you get a simple paralysis, and importantly, you can reverse it. But with a depolarizing block, there's this weird first step. You see the muscles twitch for a bit before they go limp, and you can't really reverse it in the same way. It really all comes back to that lock and key analogy. One is a dummy key that just blocks the hole, and the other is a jammed key that breaks the lock. Let's dig into that. So competitive blockers, they're the dummy key. The scientific term for them is pacu curare, which literally means thick and bulky. And that's the whole trick. Their molecule is the right shape to fit into the muscle's receptor, the lock, but it's just too big and clunky to actually turn it. So by just sitting there in the keyhole, it physically blocks the body's own key, acetylcholine, from ever getting in. No key, no turn, no muscle contraction. Now, the other way is, I think, even more clever. Depolarizing blockers are like a key that not only fits and turns the lock, but then gets stuck in the on position. It jams the whole system. So at first, it forces the muscle to fire like crazy, and that's what causes those initial twitches. But the muscle can't keep that up. It gets exhausted almost immediately, and the whole system just shuts down into paralysis. It's kind of like flicking a light switch on and off so fast that you blow the fuse. So this brings up a pretty important question. I mean, if you are the anesthesiologist and you've paralyzed your patient for surgery, how do you know exactly how paralyzed they are? And how do you know when it's safe for them to start breathing again on their own? You can't just guess, right? Well, there's a really neat technique they use called train of four stimulation, or TOF. What they do is they attach a couple of electrodes, usually on the patient's wrist over a nerve, and they deliver four tiny little electrical zaps in a row. Then they just watch the person's thumb to see how the muscle responds to each one of those zaps. And this is where you can actually see the difference between the two types of drugs. It's fascinating. With a competitive block, that's our dummy key, the muscle's response gets weaker and weaker with each zap. The fourth twitch is way weaker than the first. Doctors call this fade. But get this. With a depolarizing block, our jammed key, all four twitches are equally weak. They're all reduced, but there's no fade. And that's a huge clue. This fade isn't just some cool biological fact. It is an absolutely critical safety signal. By watching that fade, the medical team knows exactly how deep the paralysis is, and they can track how the patient is recovering. When the fade is gone and all four twitches are back to being strong, they know the drug is worn off and the patient's muscles are good to go. Okay, so we've been deep in the weeds on the heavy-duty stuff for surgery, but what about the drugs for more everyday muscle problems? For that, we actually have to totally shift where we're looking, away from the muscle itself and up into the central nervous system. This is where a whole different class of relaxants does its work. Right, because what about that horrible knot you get in your back after lifting a box the wrong way? Or what about the kind of chronic muscle tightness, called spasticity, that comes with conditions like multiple sclerosis? For those things, you definitely don't want paralysis. You just want the muscle to, chill out. And that takes a completely different kind of tool. And here's the fundamental split. The surgical blockers we've been talking about, they work right at the muscle, at that NMJ, to cause paralysis. But these other drugs, they work centrally, meaning they target the brain and the spinal cord. Their goal is not to stop you from moving. It's just to dial back that excessive muscle tone and spasm, all while leaving your voluntary strength totally fine. You might even recognize some of these names. Diazepam, for example, is also known as Valium. Drugs like these don't block the muscle directly at all. Instead, they kind of work like a volume knob on your central nervous system. They turn down those overactive nerve signals that are causing all the painful tightness. They're basically telling the brain, hey, relax your grip a little. So what we have are two very different families of drugs. One works on the muscle, one works on the brain. And as you can probably guess, picking the right tool for the job is not just important, it's absolutely critical. Let me give you a real-world scenario that shows just how high the stakes are. So imagine a patient comes in with severe, widespread burns all over their body. They need emergency surgery. The anesthesiologist has to pick a muscle relaxant to help place the breathing tube. Why is this specific choice so dangerous? Well, it all goes back to that jammed key mechanism. In a patient who has massive tissue damage, like from a severe burn, if you give them a depolarizing blocker like succinylcholine, it can trigger a huge, dangerous release of potassium from all those injured muscle cells. This can cause a fatal heart rhythm and even cardiac arrest. In that situation, choosing the dummy key blocker isn't just a better choice, it's a life-saving one. So what's the bottom line here? First, muscle relaxant is not a one-size-fits-all term. You've got your peripheral blockers for surgery and your central relaxants for spasms. Second, even within those surgical drugs, the dummy key and jammed key methods are polar opposites with totally different risks. And finally, as we just saw, knowing these differences isn't just some academic exercise. Out there in the real world, it can be the difference between life and death. From a jungle poison to a precision medical instrument, the story of muscle relaxants is really just an amazing story of scientific discovery. And it kind of leaves you with this fascinating question. As we get better and better at hacking our body's own on and off switches, what's next? What new frontiers in medicine or even in human performance are we going to unlock? Thanks for joining me on The Explainer.